Hi, thank you, Oliver, and welcome everybody to this webinar on the assessment of the impact of the new definition of endocrine disruptors for crop protection. I hope you can hear me well. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are sitting. My name is Jose Carvalho, and I'm looking after some new regulatory issues within CNOL Consult, so CNOL Germany GmbH, which is part of the group of CNOL companies. I leave my email in case you have some questions which we cannot answer at the end of this session. So for today and for expectation management, the purpose of this webinar is to address the impact of the definition in crop protection, mainly focus on the regulation 1107 and also touching the MRL regulation. There will be some parallels with the biocides regulation because the guidance is common and the criteria as well. So the first, I would like to address the how we get here in terms of the definition of the criteria and publication of the guidance. Then moving on the impact to crop protection for Europe and addressing shortly at the end of this webinar the impact we are seeing now for the rest of the world, mainly regarding crop exports and imports. So starting with EU criteria, for the people dialing in from Europe, you probably have about 5 to 10 minutes to do some emailing. I just put a couple of slides to people dialing in from outside of Europe and not working within our current regulation. So in the current framework, Regulation 1107/2009, we introduced a couple of changes compared with the former Directive 914/14. And one of the big changes we have is an hazard-based assessment for active substance or active ingredients, as we call it in the rest of the world, and also safeners and synergists. But for example, the co-formulants or inert ingredients, as we call in the US, for example, they are not explicitly covered in this approval process. And therefore, this cutoff, in principle, it's not applicable for the co-formulants. It's not as simple as we will see later on, but it's just to do an aside. We are talking about that active substance, safeners, and synergists. And in this slide, you will see the criteria. So in mutagenicity, carcinogenicity, and compounds toxic to reproduction, and endocrine disruptors. So this is linked with the classification and labeling and packaging regulation. So the well-known CLP, from where you will classify a substance as known to be or presumed to be. The problem with this cutoff, or particular for the endocrine, is there was no definition at the time, and that's where we will go in the next couple of slides. Just an aside on hazard and risk. So the hazard, and this is where we are talking now in terms of the assessment of the endocrines, is the possibility of causing harm, and risk is the probability of that harm to occur. And for this to happen, you always need something, which is exposure. And there's a couple of measures we put in place in the risk management, which for the case now for the endocrines, we will not look at this action on the exposure. So we are talking about the left side and about the hazard. And this has been an option in some regions. So the European Union included this hazard-based criteria, also Brazil, while the rest of the world is still doing risk-based assessment when they authorized plant protection products. On top of that comes a political decision at the EU level, which was to separate the assessment of active substance from the formulated products. And the reason is mainly political. So the EU could not have different markers for the residues, meaning for the food and animal feed, because there's a single market for trade. and this includes as well Switzerland, Norway, and Iceland for the active substance. Because crops are being exported and for the market to function, there need to be an agreement in terms of the active ingredients, which will be the active substance, sorry, which will be permitted into the products. And at the same time, member states didn't want to give up their decision-making power in terms of approving or authorizing the products at the country level. So the rest of the world remains with one step for active ingredients and formulated products. In the EU, we have these 2 steps. And this allowed for an hazard assessment at the basic substance level before we even look at uses or at products. So one of the criteria, and I'm mentioning the general toxicity in this case, and I'm just mentioning because you have absolutely no opportunities for derogation. From the moment you have a mutagen based on the data requirements, on the data the applicants are submitting, as well as any other available data and information, including the review of scientific literature, and for any active ingredient submission in Europe, you need to conduct a full search of the literature. Means if you come to the conclusion that the substance should be classified or to be classified, then there's no possibility to get an approval for that substance. I just made a photo, which is in the screen this morning, just an example when we think if we want to get rid of all misinformation around the internet, you just cut the cable and the problem will be solved. When we look then at the endocrine, we see there's a bit on the side of the exposure. I mentioned before that this was an hazard assessment. It's not 100% true, because when you look at the definition, at the classification, at the provisions in the regulation, sorry, you see that it's the same as for the mutagenicity. The difference is you have a provision for negligible exposure. And it states, unless the exposure of humans for that active substance, safeners or synergists, under realistic proposed conditions of use, is negligible. This means in such situation of negligible exposure, you could still get an approval of your active substance if you show negligible exposure, and applies as well for the residues. So when we look and put the 2 regulations, the biocides, once in a while I will do a parallel with the biocides, and that's quite interesting in this particular point. In the plant protection, we do have the negligible exposure. There's a draft guidance to facilitate the life of the applicants to look, and the regulators to look what actually we mean by negligible exposure. Has never been approved, but still it's a useful document to try to understand in which situations we could apply this negligible exposure. In the biocides regulation, we talk about negligible risk from the exposure, or you can still get an approval of endocrine substance if there's a disproportionate negative impact for society resulting from this non-approval. So that's under the biocide regulation. We don't have such a provision in the regulation 1107. So what we got here in the regulation 1107, so our framework regulation, it's written that by December 2013, the Commission should present to the Standing Committee on the Food Chain and Animal Health a draft considering specific scientific criteria for the determination of the endocrine properties. So this was the deadline, which was not met by the Commission. And until last year, we had the interim criteria, which state that substance classified as carcinogenic category 2 and toxic to reproduction category 2 should be considered as having endocrine disruptor properties, or if they were reprotox CAT2 and have toxic effects on endocrine organs, they may be considered to have such endocrine disrupting properties. So this was the definition we had in place, or the interim criteria we had in place until the new criteria has been published. So what happened was that one of the member states, so one of the agencies, the CHEMI, so it's a chemical agency in Sweden, sues the Commission because of this delay to present the ED criteria, and the European Court of Justice ruled out that the Commission should present a criteria for the endocrine disrupting properties based on science only and independent of economic considerations. There's a long story in between. There was a lot of discussions, lots of documents and definitions being worked. And finally, in April last year, the Commission published and adopted the ED criteria for plant protection, which is the regulation 605 from April 2018. And the biocides was around the same dates. There's also a regulation for the biocides. What it states in the regulation is firstly that the criteria should apply for November last year to all active substance safeners and synergists. And I will go back to this particular point. What does it mean to all active substance safeners and synergists? And the criteria is finally based on the WHO proposal from 2002. And this proposal has already been endorsed by the EFSA in 2013. I'm just writing this for the people that were following up. There was lots of shifts in the discussion before this was approved, but finally we got to this, the definition, back to the definition of the WHO. So the criteria written in the regulation is an ID substance will be considered as having ED properties if it shows an adverse effect. And these adverse effects would be assessed at the subpopulation level, and the results could be an impair of the function capacity or even the capacity to compensate for additional stress or increase the susceptibility to other influence. And this means all these three sub-criteria need to be met. It has an endocrine mode of action, which means alters the function of the endocrine system, and there's an adverse effect. The adverse effect observed is a consequence of the endocrine mode of action. I had a note that potency or exposure and risk nor socioeconomic impacts are included in the definition in this regulation 605. And to implement the regulation, there's a guidance produced by the European Chemical Agency, the ECHA, and the European Food and Safety Agency, the EFSA. So it's a joint guidance by the two agencies. And for the ones not familiar with the process, ECHA is driving the biocidal regulation, the CLP regulation, and the REACH regulation, among others. And the EFSA is responsible to do a peer review for active substance for the plant protection regulation for the 1107. So this guidance for the identification of endocrine disruptors in the context of these two regulations, so the biocide regulation 528 and 1107 for the plant protection product, has about 135 pages detailing how the assessment should be conducted for the endocrine disruptor assessment. So a couple of things regarding the guidance. The guidance demands that the applicant conducts very extensive literature search, and this includes epidemiological data. It's also stating, and I will get back later to the weight of evidence approach, how to conduct an assessment considering positive and negative results and quality of data. It requests, depending, of course, in which step of the assessment you are, but in some cases you will need to, or you may need to provide a mode of action detail analysis if you get to the point that you need to clarify the mode of action of the substance based on the effects or suspecting of every endocrine activity. And what is interesting in the guidance, it's in principle, the guidance is preventing you to do, or preventing applicants to generate new data, and they strongly advising to use existing data as well as some of the in silico methods and QSAR models if they can be applicable to the case. A couple of words on the weight of evidence approach. The guidance states that you should look both positives and negative results from in vitro, in vivo, and also from, if applicable, from some in silico studies available. There, we need to take into consideration that lots of the literature, the published results in the literature, they will show a positive effect because it will be difficult to publish publication if you have a no result and no effect. Then you need to assess the relevance of the study design for the assessment of adverse effects and the endocrine mode of action. This will be particularly challenged because some of the studies we have were done, or some of the studies on the substance, they were done before some of the OECD guidelines, which are referred to in the guidance document, and not necessarily the study design was taking into account these new guidance from last year, and of course the quality and consistency of the data. One interesting point is the adverse effects that are not specific secondary consequences, or better, there are non-specific secondary consequences coming from other toxic effects. They should not be considered for the identification of the endocrine disruptors. And you should answer the question in case you have some effects, if there's a link between these adverse effects observed in the studies and the endocrine mode of action. I put a slide just on the broader issues where we will have to deal with this endocrine issue in other regulations. So for the plant protection regulations and biocide product regulations, we have now this guidance guiding the applicants and the regulators how to perform the assessment. But we should not forget that the REACH regulation and as well the cosmetic regulation, they do have some provisions for endocrine disrupting substances. As well, two other regulations with an impact in plant protection, the MRL regulation, which I will touch, and the Water Framework Directive, which I will not touch, but just to make everybody aware that there's some provisions on the endocrine also in the Water Framework Directive, mainly on the substance to be included in monitoring programs. Broader issues includes the relationship at the World Trade Organization and some of the trade agreements the EU has with other countries. And this means this could be a discussion in terms of raising technical barriers to trade, as the EU has put a definition within the EU, but other countries are being, of course, consulted, and we could see some issues now coming from the World Trade Organization and broader discussions in other regulations, particularly within the pharmaceuticals, if the endocrine, as they reach the environmental as well. What are we going to do in terms of some, how we regulate some other areas like the pharmaceuticals? Below you will find a link where the discussion is at the moment, where you can get as well some updates regarding the discussion in Europe. Getting now to the impact of these AD criteria for the crop protection. So the criteria, it's clear from the regulation now that this in the scope are active substance, they are safeners and synergists, and not all the substance will be request an AD assessment. There's some provisions in the guidance where may not be requested. And I just give an example of what I will call a borderline now here. It's the basic substance, because basic substance are in principle substance not placed on the market as plant protection products. So they are already available and they can be used as plant protection products as well, but they are not placed on the market as plant protection product. So I'm not sure how this criteria is going to apply for such substance, because the procedure is different. You don't have a rapporteur member state doing the assessment, goes directly to the Commission with an opinion by the EFSA. and it's typically the process is not submitted by a company. And even if you will do an assessment, the substance will still be there for the other uses. So just to give you an example, something that it's still to be sorted. Then we have other problem as well with the safeners and synergists, because the rules to approve the safeners and synergists are not there. And the regulation 1107 states that this substance, they should only be evaluated after these rules have been established, which has not been the case. However, we have today 8 safeners and 5 synergists listed as approved in the EU database of substance approved under the regulation 1107, and the criteria, regulation 605, so the ED criteria clearly includes safeners and synergists in the scope. Other substances included in the scope of 1107 are the coformulants, or also called inert ingredients in other countries. And contrary to the US, for example, they decided for a negative list of coformulants. So basically listing all substances which will not be allowed in the formulations. And this list is currently under active discussion. So we expect to see something this year, but at the moment it's still empty. So we don't have this negative list of coformulants today. However, you will need to consider that the member states, they do have some negative lists, and they are valid until this Annex 2, or at least until this Annex 2 negative list of coformulants will be made available at the EU level. And there's nothing preventing this list to keep existing. It's just we'll have an EU negative list. At the moment, we need to go one member state by member state, which make the life of formulators extremely difficult. And here, the criteria in principle does not apply according to the regulation 1107. But again, we are at the member state level, so member states can decide whatever they include in their negative list of coformulants. And later on, the EU has also the possibility to include them in this negative list at EU level. That's just a reference on the document at the moment under discussion. It's still a draft. It's not publicly available. And also, we should not forget that the coformulants are clearly under the scope of REACH, and therefore you will need to watch if your coformulant or the substance you are using for your formulations, what is the status of them under REACH and what has been submitted under REACH. For the adjuvants, and this is for the adjuvants placed on the market as standalone to tank mixed with plant protection products, it remains a member state's national decision. And again, 1107 doesn't cover them in terms of the endocrine disrupting criteria. However, it's the same as we'll have with the coformulants. Member states can decide to not approve an adjuvant as well. But it's just to make it clear, it's not covered under the cutoff criteria under the regulation 1107. So now, if we look at the number of substances now under assessment at EU level, or if we see the number of substances approved, and I include there the microorganisms, as you know, the microorganisms in Europe, they are registered at the strain level. So you have, if you discount the microorganisms, we don't have a lot of, on this 484, we'll have much less chemical substance, if you wanted to call them, or synthetic chemical substances. And what is interesting is 263, so that's pretty much more than half of the substance are currently under a review process. Some of them are not actively being reviewed, but applicants are preparing dossiers for submission under the Annex 1 Renewal Program 4. And we still have lots of substance that should have been finalized. And that's a big concern. I would say it's all the substance submitted under the Annex 1 Renewal Program 1 and 3, which was submitted years ago and should have been finalized, they are still under assessment. And because the criteria is implemented or should be implemented since November last year, we do have a problem because some of the substance will have to be assessed against the criteria on AD, and data will be needed, which is in lots of cases will not be there because the studies were not conducted. And there's of course a big discussion regarding the plant regulators, as most of them phytohormones, and they do have endocrine or endocrine-like mode of action. And all these 30 substances, or some of these 30 substances, will be will need considerable investment to be supported. So as I mentioned, the assessments of the active substance, they took much longer than expected, particularly the R2 and the R3. So we see considerable delays in this renewal process, and some of them, the decisions they should have been taken before, and because they were not now, ED assessments will be required. And this ED assessment, so the guidance is, or in some cases you could produce some of the data or do provide your assessment under this stop the clock process, either with the rapporteur or with the EFSA. But from what we see now with the guidance is that this stop of the clock process will not allow enough time for the generation of new data in certain cases, and in others will not even will not be enough even to produce provide an assessment. So the dossiers were submitted under the requirements available at the time, so some years ago, and the studies, they are not necessarily adequate to address the ED guidance because some of the parameters are simply not there. Hormone levels or some of the amphibian data in the ecotox, which is particularly critical, they are not available. So we can expect now further delays in the process, as well as extra investment regarding, well, there's the financial investment, and which will be considerable depending on the data you will need to generate, but particularly in terms of the human resources you will need to conduct the assessment as per the guidance. And this, it's not only on the applicant side, it's also on the regulator side. And there's a lot of uncertainty because as any guidance, it's the first time it's being used. So applicants and regulators will be implementing the guidance. And we know that these phases, they usually take some time until everybody gets into a proper implementation of the guidance. And there's some room for interpretation and expert judgment. And this could lead to some disagreements as well. So from a regulatory perspective now, and looking at the guidance document from a non-technical perspective, if you wanna, after talking to some of the people doing the assessments, a common problem we saw is that the older studies, and by older, I don't mean that they are old, some of them they were conducted recently, but the guidance they changed, some of these OECD guidance are relatively recent, so the study doesn't have all the data you need. And then you will not be allowed, just by using this data, to do a proper assessment because some parameters are simply not there. So there's a big question that we believe that new studies are going to be needed in certain cases, and this raises a question of animal welfare and goes against the spirit of the regulation to try to avoid animal testing. And who is going to approve data generation to address the requirements set by the guidance document, as this is EU guidance, so it's requesting applicants to prove a non-endocrine mode of action or a non-endocrine adverse effects, and at the same time is preventing applicants for generating data. So there's a big discussion on on this data generation, as some of the studies, the data is simply not there. And if you need to clarify your mode of action, then you will also need to enter a rather new field for most of the community to show or not showing that you have a plausible link between the endocrine activity and the adverse effect. And we believe this is going to be extremely challenging. So as a conclusion, the ED assessment being done now during a renewal process may cause additional delays because of the stop the clock provisions, because they don't necessarily allow the time to run new studies, or in some cases even to perform the ED assessment based on the data available. And the discussion you will have to have with the regulators in case you don't have data available to generate new data. So what we expect now with the implementation of the guidance, and even if substances are not triggering the criteria, is just some of the applicants will not invest time and money to defend the active substance now to do an ED assessment and go through the guidance. As a consequence, and if you remember the slide with the number of active substances, we have the number of substances in assessment and the number of what we call the candidates for substitution, with 66 substances at the moment. So we see that will be less diversity of active substance in the EU, which will increase and is already increasing risk of resistance. And what is particularly critical is some niche AIs, or what we call AIs which are not generating lots of profit. Companies will likely let them drop because they will not invest for an active substance which you will not have a return on investment. And even if you will have the return on investment, there's all this uncertainty now how this guidance is going to be implemented. And one of the other issues which we should pay attention to is the overuse of remaining AIs. And as we know, they can be extremely safe or passing the approval process and being safe, but then we could have lots of issues arising from the overuse of the AIs available in the market. And this, together with the fact that we don't have new chemical AIs, or extremely few entering the system in the European Union, so companies are submitting in other regions, but submissions of new chemical entities in Europe, it's not happening. So for the rest of the world, even if this criteria is applicable under 1107 and for the EU, we need to think that there's trade going on with the rest of the world, particularly with the food and animal feed. And this slide looks very busy, but I like it very much because it makes a difference between the trade in terms of calories and also in terms of value. And you see most of the food we are trading in the EU, or the high value crops, the trade is within the EU, as you see in the top graphic on the right side. So that's lots of the fresh fruits. But then if you look down and you see some of the grains and raw crops, which are exported from the US to Asia, and also we see Brazil, Argentina there, and some as well coming to Europe. And this is just not to mention that will be a trade issue, or could be a trade issue between the EU and their trading partners, but also to keep in mind that the EU signed, for example, the big trade agreement with Japan, and agriculture is one of the main points, and Japan is getting a lot of its grains from the US. So we see that could be some issues arising there in terms of the residues, residue management. So, and now that's why I would like to address just MRL regulation. And for the ones not familiar with MRL regulation, is the highest level of a pesticide residue, which is legally tolerated in or on the food or animal feed, and we also call it tolerance in other countries. So in the case we have an active substance approved in the EU, this MRL application will be done probably by the company supporting the active substance renewal, and there will be the need to submit some residue data according to the critical GAP. So GAP is the Good Agricultural Practice table describing the uses of the product, and some of the analytical data. And there's an assumption, of course, there was already a tox assessment. In case there's a substance which is not approved in the EU, this import tolerance will have to be made into the EU if you wanted to export crops from countries where these substances are approved. And in this case, you need a full tox assessment. I'm just mentioning here because in the MRL regulation, we don't have a provision for endocrine, and it's not a cutoff. But because you need a tox assessment, you will still need to address somehow the endocrine disruption under the tox assessment for the import tolerance. And if you don't, then all crops will be dropped. So all the maximum residue levels for all crops will revert to the default in case the substance is not approved in the EU. And the default value is 0.01 milligrams per kilogram. So there's no technical reason behind. It's just an agreed value for all substance and will apply for all crops. Now, I just wanted to draw really a line between the two regulations because they are two regulatory procedures, and of course they connect then with the uses and the maximum residue levels, but they go in two different streams in terms of regulatory. And for the 1107, you do deal with approval of the active substance that will then be inside the products, and the MRLs, you will deal with the residues which are established at EU level for the food and the feed. And if you don't have, if your substance is not approved in the EU, you will need to set an import tolerance if farmers in other countries are to export their products treated with that substance into the EU. So the criteria, the ED and the guidance only applies under the regulation 1107, but of course you need to take into consideration the tox assessment under the MRLs if you intend to apply for an import tolerance in case the substance doesn't get renewed or it's not approved in the EU. Right, so I put two cases where could do a kind of a small exercise, but just to look at two particular cases of substance under renewal at the moment at EU level. So we'll have the case one where the applicant is supporting the active substance. In that case, the applicant needs to submit an assessment, an ED assessment according to the guidance from the ECHA and the EFSA. If you do not fulfill the criteria, so there's no concerns for the approval, or better for the endocrine piece, you can still have some issues with other cutoff criteria or with identifying safe uses, but for the ED, there's no issue. In case you fulfill the criteria in the human tox, for example, then you will not pass the Article 4, which is the approval of the active substance, and then you will risk a drop on the MRLs to the default value for all the crops because the AI is not going to be anymore approved in the EU, and this will have an impact or could have an impact on the food and feed exports from third countries where the substance is still in use. So the case two is the applicant decided is not going to support the active substance. So if the active substance is not to be supported, there's no need to submit endocrine assessment. And there's a possibility to apply for an import tolerance for all the crops being imported into the EU from the third countries. You need to remind that the tox assessment is needed, but today, and I would like to stress again, today there's no obligation to follow the AD guidance because it's just applicable on the regulation 1107 and not on the MRL regulation. Or then worst case is you get to the first case, it's all the MRLs will default to the 0.01 milligram per kilogram value. And if you don't have an issue with your residues, then it's fine. If you have some issues or levels above this in the final crops, then they will get rejected once they are entering a port in Europe. So as a conclusion, the burden of evidence to prove your substance or the substance are not known ED or has no AD properties is extremely high for the applicants, considering you have to go back to all the studies you have in the talks, and particularly challenge we see it's on the ecotox, where lots of the data required to do an assessment, it's simply not available, and conduct a literature review for ED activity for your substance. This, we believe, is gonna create a deadlock for data generation, because as I mentioned, it's really not available, and the guidance is trying to prevent applicants to generate new data on the animal fair grounds. It's trying to promote as well QSARs and other in silico methods, and they are still not widely accepted within the PPP community, but this will have to change in the next times in order to make this guidance practicable and not testing all the parameters. Regarding timelines, I think really that's a big challenge to try to implement this criteria for substance already under assessment, because you will have to go on all the studies or all the studies which were submitted, and you don't have the time there to even provide a proper ED assessment. Of course, this depends on the substance. We are not talking about all the substance, but there will be some substance where this is going to be an issue. And finally, it's still unclear how this ID criteria will be linked or not linked to the MRL, and this could create competition issues for the European farmers, as substance will not be supported. It's the case where companies will not support AI, the active ingredient, and the active ingredient will be still available for other farmers outside of Europe, and the crops can be then exported to the European Union. And before I close, I would like just to give a big thanks to two of my colleagues looking after the guidance for their time in terms of discussions, and try to think together how this could impact not only for the PPP, but also on the biocide side. To Michael in the talks, and to Martina for their thoughts in terms of what does it mean, the practicability of the guidance document, and what does it mean for
when it becomes so. If you're interested